thought I was seeing ghosts when those church doors creaked open during Grandma Rose's funeral. There, silhouetted against the afternoon light, stood my parents. 12 years of complete silence, and they choose this moment to reappear. Mom's designer black dress, Dad's expensive suit, both scanning the packed cathedral like predators sizing up prey. My heart hammered against my ribs as recognition hit the congregation in ripples of shocked whispers. Pastor Williams paused mid-eulogy, his voice faltering. They had come for something, and I knew it wasn't closure. The memory hit me like a physical blow as I watched them stride down that center aisle with practiced confidence. I was 9 years old again, standing on Grandma Rose's wraparound porch in rural Kansas, clutching a single battered suitcase, while watching their car disappear down the dusty gravel road. No explanation beyond Dad's hurried words about needing time to figure things out. No promise of return, just abandonment, wrapped in false reassurance. Grandma Rose had found me there 3 hours later, still waiting on that porch, like a loyal dog expecting its master's return. Her weathered hands had been gentle as she helped me inside, her voice soft but firm when she promised I would never feel alone again. She kept that promise for 12 beautiful years, teaching me to knead bread dough until my small hands grew strong, showing me which vegetables thrived in Kansas soil, and most importantly, demonstrating what unconditional love actually felt like. Now Monica and David were sliding into the pew beside me, their expensive cologne mixing unpleasantly with the church's familiar scent of aged wood and candle wax. Monica reached for my hand with manicured fingers, her touch cold as winter metal. "Darling, we rushed back from Europe the moment we heard," she whispered loud enough for the neighbors to overhear. "We're devastated we couldn't make it sooner. The flights were impossible to arrange on such short notice." Europe. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. While I had been changing Grandma Rose's bedsheets during her final illness, measuring medications, and holding her hand through countless doctor appointments, they had been touring European vineyards or lounging on Mediterranean beaches. David placed his hand on my shoulder with possessive weight, his voice carrying the same smooth authority I remembered from childhood. "Your mother and I have been sick with worry about how you've been managing all this alone, sweetheart. We should have been here to help with the arrangements." Mrs. Hartley from the neighboring farm turned in her seat, her gray eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She had driven me to the emergency room during Grandma's heart attack 6 months ago, had brought casseroles during the worst weeks, had held me while I sobbed the night Grandma Rose passed peacefully in her sleep. She knew exactly who had been managing everything alone. "Lovely service," Monica murmured, dabbing at completely dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Though we would have chosen different flowers. Mother always preferred yellow roses over these white lilies." The lie sliced through me like broken glass. Grandma Rose had specifically requested white lilies because they reminded her of the ones that bloomed wild along the creek behind the farmhouse each spring. She had told me this story dozens of times while we picked berries or collected eggs from the henhouse. Monica knew nothing about what Grandma Rose preferred, had never bothered to learn. Pastor Williams was struggling to continue his eulogy, his kind eyes flickering nervously toward our family drama unfolding in the front pew. The congregation's attention had shifted entirely from celebrating Grandma Rose's life to witnessing this unexpected reunion. I could feel their collective confusion, their whispered questions about where these well-dressed strangers had been for the past decade. David leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "We'll need to discuss Mother's affairs after the service, Elisa. There are legal matters that require immediate attention, and we want to ensure everything is handled properly." Legal matters. My stomach twisted with sudden understanding. They had not returned for love or grief or even basic human decency. They had calculated the timing of Grandma Rose's death against the potential value of her estate and decided the trip was finally worth their investment. Monica was already scanning the church with calculating eyes, taking mental inventory of the turnout, the quality of the floral arrangements, the obvious expense of the mahogany casket. Her smile had the sharp edges of a woman pricing furniture at an estate sale. The pastor's voice grew stronger as he found his rhythm again, speaking about Grandma Rose's generous spirit and the way she had touched countless lives in their small farming community. He mentioned her volunteer work at the food bank, her participation in the church quilting circle, her reputation for never turning away anyone who needed help. Every word was a testament to the woman who had raised me with such fierce love and practical wisdom. But my parents were not listening to Pastor Williams. David was whispering urgently to Monica about property values and inheritance taxes, while she nodded and made soft humming sounds of agreement. They were conducting business negotiations over Grandma Rose's cooling body, treating her funeral like a board meeting where they could finally claim their prize. The service concluded with a hymn that Grandma Rose had requested, one about going home to rest. As the congregation filed out toward the cemetery for the burial, Monica linked her arm through mine with false intimacy. "We have so much catching up to do, darling. 12 years feels like a lifetime, doesn't it? We want to hear everything about your life, about how you've been taking care of our dear mother." Our mother. The possessive pronoun made my skin crawl. Grandma Rose had been my mother in every way that mattered, while Monica had been a biological stranger who had discarded me like an unwanted Christmas gift. But I said nothing as we walked toward the gravesite, letting them maintain their performance for the community, because somewhere deep in my chest, that abandoned 9-year-old girl was still hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, they had genuinely missed me. Maybe they had spent 12 years regretting their choice, searching for a way back to the daughter they had left behind. Even as my adult mind recognized their manipulation, my heart still yearned for the parents I had always imagined might return someday to explain, to apologize, to love me the way Grandma Rose had loved me. That fragile hope would not survive much longer. The Kansas wind whipped across the hilltop cemetery as we gathered around Grandma Rose's gravesite, and I watched Monica transform into a grieving daughter with the skill of a seasoned actress. Her shoulders shook with theatrical sobs as she clutched David's arm, her voice breaking with perfectly timed emotion as she spoke about her dear, sweet mother who had been taken far too soon. The performance was flawless, except for the audience. Mrs. Hartley stood with her husband Frank, both of them wearing identical expressions of bewildered skepticism. Bill Martinez from the grocery store kept shaking his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile these strangers with the daughter and son-in-law who had never once visited during his 30 years of knowing Rose Morrison. Pastor Williams maintained his professional composure, but his jaw tightened each time Monica wailed about her devastating loss. "Mother was everything to us," David announced to the gathered mourners, his voice carrying across the cemetery with practiced authority. "She was the foundation of our family, the source of all our strength. Monica and I are just grateful we could provide her with the love and support she deserved during her final years." I felt my face burn with indignation, but before I could respond, Monica was reaching into her designer handbag and producing what appeared to be evidence. She spread items across the small table beside the grave with the confidence of a prosecutor presenting her case. "We have all the emails here," she said, her voice still thick with fake tears. "Every medical consultation, every birthday card, every care package we sent. Mother insisted we respect her independence, but we were constantly involved in her well-being from afar." The papers looked official enough from a distance. Medical consultation printouts with doctored headers, birthday cards with forged signatures, shipping receipts for packages that had never existed. Monica even produced photographs that appeared to show recent visits, carefully edited images that placed her and David in settings that suggested regular contact with Grandma Rose. Dr. Patricia Newsom, who had been Grandma's physician for over 20 years, stepped closer to examine the medical documents. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught her exchanging a meaningful glance with Pastor Williams. "These consultation emails are interesting," Dr. Newsom said diplomatically. "I don't recall coordinating any treatments with outside family members during Mrs. Morrison's care." David smoothly intercepted the challenge. We worked through private specialists in Chicago to ensure Mother received the best possible advice. We wanted to supplement her local care without interfering with the excellent work you were already doing, Doctor. Monica was now showing off an elaborate diamond tennis bracelet, claiming it was a recent gift from Grandma Rose. The bracelet probably cost more than Grandma had spent on groceries in an entire year, but Monica presented it as evidence of their close relationship and her mother's generous appreciation. "Mother insisted I wear this today," Monica said, stroking the diamonds with reverent fingers. "She said it would help me remember her love during this difficult time." Bill Martinez could contain himself no longer. His face had grown increasingly red during their presentation, and now he stepped forward with the blunt honesty of a man who had watched this family's dynamics for decades. "With respect, ma'am, I've been delivering groceries to Rose Morrison for 15 years, and I never once saw either of you at that farmhouse. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not when she was sick. Elisa here was the one buying her medications, driving her to appointments, making sure she had everything she needed." Monica's mask slipped for just an instant, her eyes flashing with genuine anger before she recovered her composure. "We respected Mother's wishes for privacy. She specifically asked us to maintain some distance while she enjoyed her independence. But that doesn't mean we weren't constantly supporting her through other means." David nodded gravely, pulling out his phone to show what appeared to be bank transfer records. "We provided significant financial assistance through discreet channels. Mother was very proud, and she didn't want the community to know she was receiving help from her children." The documents looked convincing enough to fool casual observers, but I knew they were fabricated. Grandma Rose had managed her finances with the meticulous care of a woman who had lived through the Great Depression. Every penny was accounted for, every expense justified. She'd been financially independent until the day she died, supported by careful savings and a modest pension from Grandpa's years at the grain elevator. Mrs. Hartley was studying Monica's jewelry with the sharp eyes of a woman who had known Rose Morrison for 40 years. "That's a beautiful bracelet, dear. Rose always did love diamonds, though I'm surprised she could afford something so expensive on her pension." The comment hit its target. Monica's grip tightened possessively on the jewelry while David stepped protectively closer to his wife. Their facade of grief was beginning to crack under the community's gentle but persistent questioning. "Mother was more financially secure than people realized," David said carefully. "She made some excellent investment decisions over the years, and she wanted to enjoy sharing her good fortune with her children." Pastor Williams cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should focus on celebrating Rose's life, rather than dwelling on material concerns. She was a woman of great faith and generosity, and I know she would want us to remember her spirit, rather than her possessions." But Monica was not finished with her performance. She moved to the head of the grave, kneeling dramatically beside the fresh earth, while clutching a handful of soil to her chest. "Mother, I promise we'll honor your memory properly. David and I will take care of everything just like you would have wanted. We'll make sure your final wishes are respected and your legacy is preserved." The words sounded noble enough, but I heard the underlying message clearly. They were already making claims on Grandma Rose's estate, positioning themselves as the rightful inheritors of whatever wealth she had accumulated. Their grief was nothing more than a business strategy. Their tears calculated investments in potential profit. As we walked away from the gravesite, I overheard David speaking quietly into his phone, mentioning property appraisals and estate lawyers. Monica was already planning renovations to the farmhouse, discussing modern updates and potential resale values, with the casual confidence of someone who had already claimed ownership. The community members dispersed slowly, many of them stopping to offer me genuine condolences and share memories of Grandma Rose's kindness. Their warmth stood in stark contrast to my parents' calculating coldness, reminding me which relationships were built on love and which ones were founded on opportunity. But as I accepted their hugs and listened to their stories, I could not shake the growing dread in my stomach. My parents had not returned to reconnect with their daughter or mourn their mother. They had come to collect what they believed was rightfully theirs, and they were prepared to use any deception necessary to claim their prize. The question was whether Grandma Rose had anticipated their return and taken steps to protect the inheritance she had always intended for me. 2 days after the funeral, I discovered just how thoroughly my parents had researched their invasion. I arrived at the farmhouse that morning to find their rental car already parked in the circular driveway, and through the kitchen window I could see Monica cataloging the antique china with the methodical precision of an auctioneer. The front door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning. Grandma Rose had always kept that door secured, a habit formed during her years of living alone on 50 acres of isolated Kansas farmland. But my parents had somehow obtained keys, though I could not imagine from where or whom. I found them in the formal dining room where David was measuring the dimensions of Grandma's mahogany table, while Monica photographed each piece of inherited silver. They had transformed the space into a makeshift appraisal center with notebooks full of calculations and printed listings from auction house websites scattered across every surface. "There you are, sweetheart," Monica said without looking up from her inventory. "We've been making excellent progress on cataloging Mother's belongings. You wouldn't believe how valuable some of these pieces are. This silver tea service alone could fund a nice vacation." David glanced up from his measuring tape, his expression businesslike and efficient. "We've contacted several estate sale companies to get preliminary valuations. The antique dealers in Topeka are very interested in the bedroom furniture, and apparently the quilts your grandmother made are worth significant money to collectors." My throat constricted as I watched them reduce Grandma Rose's treasured possessions to dollar amounts. The silver tea service had been a wedding gift from her mother, used only for special occasions and polished with religious devotion every month. The quilts represented hundreds of hours of careful needlework, each one commemorating a family milestone or seasonal celebration. These items held decades of memories, not investment potential. "You can't just start selling her things," I managed to say, though my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "The will hasn't been read yet. We don't even know what her final wishes were." Monica finally looked at me directly, her smile sharp with condescension. "Of course we're not selling anything yet, darling. We're simply being responsible about understanding the estate's value so we can make informed decisions later. Mother would have wanted us to be practical about these matters." David folded his measuring tape with a satisfied snap. "Actually, that brings us to an important point. We've hired an attorney to represent the family's interests during the probate process. Jackson Pierce comes highly recommended from our contacts in Chicago, and he specializes in complex inheritance cases." The name meant nothing to me, but David spoke it with the reverence reserved for expensive acquisitions. I had a sinking feeling that Jackson Pierce was the kind of lawyer who specialized in helping wealthy families manipulate inheritance laws to their advantage. "What about Samuel Morrison?" I asked. "He's been Grandma's attorney for 20 years. He knows her wishes better than anyone." Monica and David exchanged a look that made my stomach churn. It was the same expression I remembered from childhood when they were planning something that would not benefit me. "We contacted Morrison's office yesterday," David said carefully. "Unfortunately, he seems to be unavailable for immediate consultation. His secretary was very vague about when he might return, which is concerning given the time-sensitive nature of estate matters. Pierce assured us that delays in will readings can create unnecessary complications," Monica added. "He's prepared to expedite the process to ensure Mother's wishes are honored without bureaucratic interference." I felt the walls of Grandma Rose's beloved home closing in around me. My parents had been in town for less than 72 hours, and they had already begun dismantling the life she had built with such care. They were treating her death like a business opportunity, her home like a retail space awaiting liquidation. The worst part was their casual assumption that I would simply step aside and allow them to take control. They spoke about family decisions and estate management as if I were still the powerless 9-year-old they had abandoned, incapable of having opinions about the woman who had raised me with such devoted love. Monica wandered into the kitchen, opening cabinets and examining the everyday dishes with the same calculating attention she had given the valuable antiques. "We'll need to discuss your living situation too, Elisa. This house is far too large for one person, and maintaining 50 acres requires resources that might be better invested elsewhere." The implication was clear. They expected me to return to whatever life I had been living before Grandma Rose's death, leaving them free to dispose of the property without considering my attachment to the only real home I had ever known. David joined his wife in the kitchen, pulling real estate listings from his briefcase with the enthusiasm of a man who had already made profitable plans. The land values in this area have increased substantially over the past decade. With some strategic improvements and proper marketing, this property could attract buyers from Kansas City who are looking for weekend retreats or retirement homes. "You're talking about selling the farmhouse," I said, though it was not really a question. The answer was written in their excited expressions and detailed planning documents. "We're discussing options," David corrected diplomatically. "Nothing will be decided until after the will reading, of course, but it's important to consider all possibilities so we can make the best choices for everyone involved." Everyone involved. The phrase would have been laughable if it had not been so insulting. They had not been involved in any aspect of Grandma Rose's life for 12 years, but now they expected to make decisions about her legacy based on their own financial interests. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see Pastor Williams asking if I needed any assistance with post-funeral arrangements. His gentle concern stood in stark contrast to my parents' aggressive planning, reminding me that I was not completely alone in this situation. But as I looked around the kitchen, where Grandma Rose had taught me to make pie crusts and canned vegetables, where we had shared countless cups of coffee and solved the world's problems together, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was about to lose. My parents had returned not to claim their daughter, but to claim their inheritance. And unless Samuel Morrison reappeared soon with Grandma Rose's actual will, I feared they might succeed in erasing every trace of the life she had built for us here. The sound of expensive car tires on gravel announced Jackson Pierce's arrival, and I watched through the window as a man in a $1,000 suit emerged from a black luxury sedan. He moved with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted through legal manipulation. Time was running out, and I had no idea how to fight an enemy I had never expected to face. Pastor Williams arrived at the farmhouse the next morning, carrying a manila folder thick enough to stop bullets, his usually gentle expression set with unusual determination. I had been sitting on the front porch swing since dawn, unable to sleep after listening to my parents and Jackson Pierce plan their legal strategy late into the night. "Elisa, honey, we need to talk," Pastor Williams said, settling beside me on the swing that Grandma Rose had loved so dearly. "The church community has been discussing your situation, and we want you to know you're not facing this alone." He opened the folder to reveal a collection that took my breath away. Photographs spanning 12 years, dozens of them showing me at every church event, every community gathering, every moment that marked my growth from an abandoned child into a young woman. There I was at age 10, helping serve Thanksgiving dinner to families in need. At 13, participating in the youth group's mission trip to rebuild homes after tornado damage. At 16, receiving my high school graduation recognition from the congregation that had watched me grow up. "Mrs. Hartley has been collecting these for years." Pastor Williams explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She said she always knew they would be important someday, though she hoped that day would never come." Mrs. Hartley herself appeared around the corner of the house carrying a box of documents and wearing the fierce expression of a woman prepared for battle. Behind her came Bill Martinez with a stack of receipts, Dr. Patricia Newsom with medical files, and Thomas Wright from the First National Bank carrying what appeared to be years of account records. "Those people in there," Mrs. Hartley said, nodding toward the house where my parents and their lawyer were conducting business. Think they can waltz back into this community and rewrite history? Well, we have news for them. She spread photographs across the porch table with the efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Each image told part of the story of my real relationship with Grandma Rose. Christmas mornings where I was the only family member present to watch her open gifts. Easter services where we sat together in our usual pew, sharing hymn books and whispered prayers. Summer afternoons when I helped her tend the garden that provided vegetables for half the neighborhood. Bill Martinez stepped forward with his box of receipts, his weathered hands gentle as he handled the papers that documented 12 years of care. Every prescription medication, every grocery order, every medical supply. Elisa's name is on every single receipt as the person who purchased what Rose needed to stay healthy and comfortable. Dr. Newsom pulled out Grandma Rose's medical files, her professional demeanor softened by obvious affection for both her former patient and me. Rose listed Elisa as her emergency contact for over 10 years. Every medical decision, every treatment plan, every end-of-life directive went through this young woman. There's no record of any consultation with other family members. Thomas Wright spread bank records across another section of the porch table, his banker's precision evident in the organized presentation. These account statements show that Elisa has been managing Rose's finances for the past 3 years. Bill payments, medical expenses, household costs. Rose specifically added her to all accounts as the authorized user and beneficiary. The weight of their evidence was overwhelming. While my parents had been living their lives without a single thought for the woman who had given birth to one of them, I had been integrated into every aspect of Grandma Rose's daily existence. The community had witnessed and documented my devotion, creating an unbreakable record of genuine family bonds. "There's more," Mrs. Hartley said, producing sworn statements from what appeared to be dozens of community members. "Everyone who knew Rose Morrison has written testimony about who has been caring for her and who has been absent. Pastor Williams organized the collection of statements, and we had them notarized to ensure legal validity." Pastor Williams nodded solemnly. "We contacted retired Judge Margaret Foster to oversee the process. She wanted to ensure everything was documented properly in case legal challenges arose. Judge Foster has known this family for 30 years, and she was very concerned when she heard about recent developments." I felt tears burning my eyes as I realized the extent of the community's love and support. These people had not just watched me grow up. They had been documenting my relationship with Grandma Rose because they understood its value and wanted to protect it. They had anticipated this moment when outsiders might try to invalidate the family bonds we had built through daily acts of love and sacrifice. Dr. Newsom placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Rose spoke about you constantly during her medical appointments. She was so proud of your accomplishments, so grateful for your care during her illness. She often said you were the greatest gift of her later years. She called you her true daughter." Mrs. Hartley added, her voice breaking slightly. "Not her granddaughter, not her ward, but her daughter. She said you had given her a reason to wake up every morning and a sense of purpose she had never expected to find again." The sound of expensive shoes on the porch boards announced Jackson Pierce's emergence from the house. He surveyed our gathering with the cold calculation of a predator, assessing threats his expensive suit and practiced arrogance standing in stark contrast to the simple honesty of the community members surrounding me. "I hope you're not planning to interfere with legitimate inheritance proceedings," Pierce said, his voice carrying the subtle menace of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents through legal threats. Emotional testimony from neighbors, however well-intentioned, has no bearing on statutory inheritance rights. Pastor Williams stood slowly, his 6-foot frame, giving him a height advantage that he rarely used, but employed now with quiet authority. "We're simply ensuring that accurate information is available when legal decisions are made. Truth has a way of serving justice, don't you think, Counselor?" Pierce's smile was sharp as a blade. "Blood family has legal standing that supersedes community sentiment. I'm sure you understand the distinction between legal rights and emotional attachments." "Oh, we understand distinctions quite well," Mrs. Hartley replied, her sweet grandmother voice carrying steel underneath. "The distinction between people who show up when someone needs help and people who show up when there's money involved. The distinction between 12 years of daily care and 12 years of complete absence." Bill Martinez stepped closer to Pierce, his work-hardened hands steady as he gestured toward the evidence spread across the porch tables. "You can threaten all you want, lawyer man, but facts are facts. This girl has been Rose Morrison's family in every way that matters, while your clients abandoned both of them without a backward glance." Pierce seemed momentarily unsettled by the community's unified resistance to his intimidation tactics. He had clearly expected to cow a group of small-town residents with legal threats and big-city arrogance, but instead he faced people who had known genuine love and recognized its opposite when they saw it. From inside the house, I could hear Monica's voice rising in anger as she discovered us gathering evidence on the porch. Her footsteps approached rapidly, and when she emerged, her carefully maintained facade had completely dissolved into naked fury. "What is this circus?" she demanded, surveying the photographs and documents with obvious alarm. "Are you people seriously trying to interfere with family business? Elisa is a sweet girl, but she's not legally entitled to anything that belongs to our mother." "Your mother," Mrs. Hartley repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "The mother you haven't contacted in over a decade, the mother whose funeral you used as a networking opportunity, the mother whose possessions you started cataloging before her body was cold." The confrontation I had been dreading was finally beginning, and I realized that I would not face it alone. This community had raised me alongside Grandma Rose, and they were prepared to fight for the family bonds we had built together. But as I watched Pierce whisper urgently into his phone, probably calling for reinforcements or researching intimidation strategies, I knew this battle was far from over. My parents had underestimated the power of chosen family, but they had not yet revealed all of their weapons in this fight for Grandma Rose's legacy. The first light of dawn was breaking over the Kansas horizon when a battered pickup truck pulled into the farmhouse driveway, its engine coughing like an old man with too many cigarettes in his past. I'd been awake all night, sitting by the kitchen window and watching for Pierce's promised reinforcements, but instead of legal muscle, I saw Samuel Morrison climbing out of that ancient Ford with the slow deliberation of a man who had been carrying heavy secrets. Morrison looked nothing like the polished attorney I remembered from previous visits to discuss Grandma Rose's affairs. His usually neat silver hair was disheveled, his customary suit replaced by worn jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. But his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him the most respected lawyer in 3 counties, and he carried multiple briefcases and file boxes, like a general arriving with ammunition for a crucial battle. Pierce emerged from the house at the sound of the truck, his expensive loafers slipping slightly on the morning dew as he approached Morrison with the aggressive confidence of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Morrison, I presume," Pierce said, extending a manicured hand that Morrison ignored completely. "I'm Jackson Pierce, representing the Morrison family interests. Your office has been remarkably difficult to reach. We were beginning to think you had abandoned your professional responsibilities." Morrison set his briefcases on the porch with careful precision, his weathered hands steady, despite what appeared to be several sleepless nights. When he finally looked at Pierce, his expression carried the cold authority of a man who'd been practicing law when Pierce was still learning to tie his shoes. "I've been conducting necessary research," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet power that made courtrooms fall silent. "When unusual circumstances arise around a state, matters responsible attorneys investigate before proceeding. I've discovered some very interesting information about recent activities concerning this property." Monica and David appeared in the doorway, their faces showing the first cracks of genuine concern I had seen since their arrival. They had clearly expected Morrison to remain conveniently absent while Pierce expedited their inheritance claims, But now they faced the lawyer who knew Grandma Rose's actual wishes and had the legal authority to enforce them. "We appreciate your thoroughness," David said carefully, "but time-sensitive matters require prompt attention. Mother's estate needs to be settled efficiently to prevent complications and ensure proper distribution of assets." Morrison pulled a thick folder from his briefcase, his movements deliberate as he spread documents across the porch table where the community's evidence still lay scattered. Efficiency is important, but accuracy is essential. I've been researching the background of all parties involved in this inheritance, and I've discovered some concerning discrepancies that require immediate attention. Pierce stepped closer, his predatory instincts obviously triggered by Morrison's confident demeanor. "What kind of discrepancies? I hope you're not suggesting any irregularities in my client's legitimate inheritance claims." Morrison's smile was thin as winter ice. "Let me introduce my associate Linda Torres, who specializes in inheritance fraud investigation." A woman emerged from the passenger side of Morrison's truck, her appearance suggesting law enforcement background rather than legal training. Torres moved with the precise alertness of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations, and she carried electronic equipment that looked far more sophisticated than typical legal documentation. "Ms. Torres has been monitoring some interesting communications." Morrison continued nodding toward Pierce and my parents. "Phone calls to unknown contacts, attempts to access financial records through fraudulent means, efforts to bribe local officials for expedited processing of estate documents." Monica's face went pale beneath her expensive makeup, while David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Pierce maintained his professional composure, but I caught him glancing toward his luxury sedan as if calculating escape routes. "Those are serious accusations," Pierce said, his voice carefully controlled. "I hope you have substantial evidence to support such claims, because false allegations against licensed attorneys carry severe professional consequences." Torres stepped forward, her equipment case clicking open to reveal recording devices and surveillance gear that looked more appropriate for federal investigations than small-town legal disputes. "We have extensive documentation of fraudulent activities, phone conversations discussing forged documents, attempts to manipulate probate court schedules, coordination with accomplices in other states for similar inheritance schemes." The revelation hit like lightning across the farmhouse porch. My parents had not simply returned to claim an unexpected inheritance. They were part of a larger operation that targeted elderly family members for systematic financial exploitation. Morrison pulled out additional files, his expression grim as he spread evidence across the table. "David and Monica have been involved in at least 6 similar cases over the past decade. Elderly relatives who died under suspicious circumstances, wills that were contested through fraudulent means, family members who were intimidated or manipulated into surrendering inheritance rights." Mrs. Hartley gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest as the implications sank in. "You mean they've done this to other families? Other children like Elisa?" "Worse," Torres replied, her voice carrying the hard edge of someone who had seen too much human cruelty. "They've abandoned multiple children with elderly relatives, then returned to claim inheritances when those relatives died. The pattern is consistent across 3 states, always targeting isolated elderly people with significant assets and limited family support." Pastor Williams had joined our growing circle, his face reflecting the horror that any decent person would feel upon learning such information. How many children have they abandoned? How many elderly people have they victimized? Morrison shuffled through his files, pulling out photographs and case summaries that painted a picture of systematic family destruction. At least 8 children abandoned with elderly relatives over 15 years. 4 successful inheritance frauds totaling over $12 million. 3 cases currently under investigation by federal authorities. David finally exploded, his carefully maintained facade cracking under the weight of exposure. "This is ridiculous. We're legitimate family members seeking our rightful inheritance from my mother. These wild conspiracy theories are nothing more than desperate attempts to discredit our legal standing. Your legal standing. Morrison repeated, his voice heavy with contempt. You abandoned your daughter when she was 9 years old. You had no contact with Rose Morrison for over 12 years. You appeared at her funeral with forged documents and fraudulent evidence. You hired an attorney who specializes in inheritance manipulation rather than working with Rose's longtime legal counsel. Torres was now setting up recording equipment, her movements efficient as she prepared to document whatever confessions might emerge from increasing pressure. We have evidence that you've been planning this inheritance fraud since Rose Morrison's first heart attack 18 months ago. Phone records show communications with accomplices, research into property values coordination with corrupt legal professionals. Pierce was backing toward his sedan, his confidence finally cracking as he realized the magnitude of the investigation closing around him. I was hired to represent legitimate inheritance interests. If my clients misrepresented their circumstances, that's not my responsibility. Actually, Morrison said, producing a final folder that he had been saving for this moment. You've represented similar fraudulent claims in Illinois, Ohio, and Montana. The FBI has been building a case against your entire operation for over 2 years. The words hit the assembled group like physical blows. Federal investigation, multi-state fraud operation, years of planning and execution that had destroyed families and stolen millions of dollars from elderly victims who had trusted their own relatives. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized the true scope of my parents' betrayal. They had not simply abandoned me. They had abandoned multiple children as part of a calculated strategy to exploit elderly family members. Their return to claim Grandma Rose's inheritance was not an isolated act of greed, but part of a systematic pattern of family destruction. Monica was now crying real tears for the first time since her arrival, though. Whether from fear, shame, or anger was impossible to determine. David stood frozen as Torres continued setting up surveillance equipment, his mind obviously racing through escape options and damage control strategies. But Morrison was not finished with his revelations. He pulled out a final briefcase, this one secured with multiple locks that suggested its contents were particularly sensitive. Rose Morrison was not a naive elderly woman who could be easily manipulated. He said, his voice carrying deep respect for his longtime client. She suspected her son and daughter-in-law might eventually return with ulterior motives, and she took extensive precautions to protect both Elisa and her own legacy. The locks clicked open with finality, and Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of a man about to deliver justice that had been years in the making. Rose Morrison had been recording every conversation, every phone call, every interaction with David and Monica for over 5 years. She documented their attempts to manipulate her, their threats against Elisa, their coordination with criminal accomplices. She worked with federal investigators to build an airtight case against the entire fraud operation. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the morning wind rustling through the cornfields that surrounded Grandma Rose's beloved farmhouse. My parents had walked into a trap that had been 5 years in the making, constructed by a woman they had underestimated and executed by investigators they never suspected existed. Pierce was now running toward his sedan, his expensive shoes slipping on the gravel as he abandoned his clients to save himself from the federal charges that were obviously imminent. But Torres was already speaking into a radio, coordinating with law enforcement units that were apparently positioned around the property. The game was over, but the revelations were just beginning. Morrison lifted a digital recording device from his briefcase. With the reverence of a man handling sacred artifacts, his weathered fingers steady, as he prepared to play evidence that would shatter my parents' carefully constructed lies forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the porch as our unlikely assembly gathered closer, drawn by the promise of truth that had been hidden for far too long. Rose Morrison was many things. Morrison began, his voice heavy with admiration for his deceased client. Naive was not one of them. She suspected that David and Monica would eventually return when they believed she had something worth stealing, so she took steps to protect both herself and Elisa from their manipulation. He pressed play on the device, and suddenly Grandma Rose's voice filled the morning air with startling clarity. The recording was dated 4 years and 7 months ago, and her tone carried the firm authority of a woman who would not be intimidated by her own son. David, I've told you 3 times that I will not sign those papers. Grandma Rose said, her voice steady, despite what sounded like considerable pressure. This house belongs to me, and I'll decide what happens to it when I'm gone. Elisa has been my family for 8 years now, while you abandoned both of us without explanation. David's voice was clearly audible in the background, though younger and less polished than his current calculated charm. Mother, you're being unreasonable. Monica and I are your actual family, your flesh and blood. That girl is just temporary, and you're making decisions based on misplaced sentiment rather than practical reality. Monica's voice joined the conversation, her tone sharp with barely controlled anger. We're trying to help you plan for the future, Rose. You're getting older, you need proper care, and Elisa can't provide the resources you'll eventually require. We can arrange professional care while ensuring your assets are protected for legitimate family members. The recording continued for several more minutes, documenting my parents' systematic attempts to pressure Grandma Rose into signing property deeds, updating her will to favor them, and removing me from any position of financial responsibility. Their voices grew increasingly aggressive as she continued to refuse their demands, revealing the calculated cruelty that had always lurked beneath their superficial charm. Mrs. Hartley's face had gone white as she listened to the conversation, her hand pressed against her chest, as if physically wounded by the revelation of such family betrayal. How could they speak to their own mother that way? How could they be so cruel about that sweet child? Morrison stopped the recording and selected another file, his expression grim as he prepared to reveal even more damaging evidence. This conversation took place 18 months later, after Rose had begun experiencing heart problems. David and Monica became more aggressive once they realized she might not live much longer. The second recording was even more disturbing than the first. Monica's voice was shrill with frustration as she screamed at Grandma Rose about wasting family money on my college preparation courses and medical expenses. You're throwing away thousands of dollars on that ungrateful brat while your actual children struggle to make ends meet, Monica shouted, her careful facade completely abandoned in favor of raw greed. We have expenses too, Rose. We have needs that should take priority over some random kid you picked up out of misplaced guilt. Grandma Rose's response was calm but firm, carrying the strength that had sustained her through decades of Kansas farming and family disappointments. Elisa is not random Monica. She's my daughter in every way that matters. She's been here when I was sick, when I was lonely, when I needed someone to depend on. You abandoned her when she was 9 years old, and you abandoned me at the same time. David's voice was cold with calculation as he laid out what sounded like a carefully rehearsed threat. Mother, you need to understand the consequences of your choices. If you continue prioritizing Elisa over your legitimate family, you might find that we're not available when you really need help. Emergencies happen, especially for elderly people living alone. It would be unfortunate if no one was around to assist during a crisis. The threat was clear enough to make my stomach turn. They were essentially promising to ensure Grandma Rose suffered or died alone if she did not restructure her inheritance to favor them. Their callousness was breathtaking, but what shocked me more was Grandma Rose's response. David, I've been recording these conversations for months now, she said, her voice steady as granite. Every threat, every manipulation, every cruel word you've spoken about the child I love. I have documentation that would interest federal investigators, especially given your history of similar activities in other states. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as my parents realized their mother had been collecting evidence against them all along. Morrison paused the recording and looked directly at my parents, who were now standing frozen with horror as they realized the extent of their exposure. Rose Morrison contacted the FBI 14 months before her death. She provided extensive documentation of your fraud operation, your abandonment of multiple children, your systematic targeting of elderly relatives for financial exploitation. Torres stepped forward with additional recording equipment, her professional demeanor suggesting she had been part of this investigation from the beginning. We have over 6 hours of recorded conversations documenting threats, manipulation, attempts, coordination with criminal accomplices, and detailed planning for inheritance fraud. The evidence is comprehensive enough to support federal charges against the entire operation. Monica finally broke her stunned silence, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch as the magnitude of their situation became clear. She was recording us illegally. Those conversations can't be used as evidence because she didn't have permission to document private family discussions. Morrison's smile was sharp as a courtroom objection. Actually, Kansas is a single-party consent state, which means Rose had every legal right to record conversations that took place in her own home. But even more importantly, she disclosed the recording system to both of you during your third visit. He fast-forwarded to another section of audio where Grandma Rose's voice clearly informed David and Monica that she had installed security cameras and recording devices throughout the house for safety purposes. "I wanted you to know about the recording system so you could be careful about what you say," Grandma Rose had told them. "I wouldn't want anyone to accidentally incriminate themselves during family conversations." David's recorded response was filled with nervous laughter. "Mother, you're becoming paranoid in your old age. Family members don't need to worry about being recorded during private conversations." "Family members who have nothing to hide don't need to worry," Grandma Rose had replied. "Family members with criminal intentions might want to be more careful." Pastor Williams shook his head in amazement as he realized the sophisticated trap that Grandma Rose had constructed around my parents. She knew exactly what they were planning, and she gave them every opportunity to change their behavior before documenting evidence for law enforcement. Torres was now connecting her recording equipment to speakers that would allow the entire gathering to hear the evidence clearly. The final recordings are particularly damaging because they document specific criminal planning. David and Monica discuss forging legal documents, bribing court officials, intimidating potential witnesses, and coordinating with accomplices in other states. Morrison selected what appeared to be the most recent recording dated just 3 months before Grandma Rose's death. This conversation took place after Rose's second heart attack, when David and Monica realized they needed to accelerate their timeline. Monica's recorded voice was filled with cold calculation as she discussed their inheritance strategy. "The old woman won't live much longer anyway. Her heart is failing, and those medications won't keep her alive indefinitely. We need to position ourselves now so we can move quickly once she's gone." David's voice was equally callous as he outlined their post-death strategy. "We'll arrive for the funeral with full documentation of our family relationship and our rightful inheritance claims. That girl won't have any legal standing against legitimate family members, especially if we bring our own attorney to expedite the probate process." "And if she tries to contest our claims?" Monica asked. "She's young, naive, and emotionally devastated by grief," David replied. "She won't have the resources or knowledge to fight a prolonged legal battle against experienced attorneys. We'll overwhelm her with paperwork and legal threats until she accepts a token settlement and disappears." The recording captured them laughing about my expected emotional collapse, treating my anticipated grief as a strategic advantage in their inheritance fraud. They had planned not just to steal Grandma Rose's legacy, but to traumatize me so thoroughly that I would be incapable of fighting their claims. But the final section of the recording revealed Grandma Rose's voice one last time speaking directly to the recording device after my parents had left the house. "If anyone is listening to this after my death, please know that David and Monica Morrison have revealed their true nature through their own words," she said, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained her through 91 years of life. "They are not family to me or to Elisa. Family is built through love, commitment, sacrifice, and daily acts of care. These people abandoned both of us years ago, and they have no claim on the love or legacy that Elisa and I built together. The recording ended, leaving our gathering in profound silence as the magnitude of Grandma Rose's final gift became clear. She had not only protected her inheritance from fraudulent claims, she had ensured that my parents' criminal activities would be exposed and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Morrison closed the recording device with finality and looked directly at my parents, who were now standing pale and trembling as they realized their carefully planned fraud had become the evidence for their own prosecution. "The FBI will be here within the hour," he said simply. "You have that long to decide whether you want to cooperate with federal investigators or face the full consequences of your criminal conspiracy." The formal reading took place in Morrison's law office 3 days later after my parents had been arrested and released on federal bail pending trial. The FBI had seized their recording equipment and fraudulent documentation, but they were required to remain in Kansas for the probate proceedings that would determine the actual distribution of Grandma Rose's estate. Morrison's office reflected 40 years of small-town legal practice, with oak furniture that had witnessed countless family disputes and walls lined with law books that predated modern legal databases. The conference table was large enough to accommodate all interested parties, though the atmosphere was tense enough to make the spacious room feel claustrophobic. My parents sat across from me with their new court-appointed attorney, a harried public defender named Robert Chen, who looked like he had drawn the short straw in the county legal lottery. Jackson Pierce had fled Kansas immediately after learning about the federal investigation, leaving David and Monica to face both criminal charges and inheritance proceedings without their sophisticated legal support. The community members who had rallied to my defense were present as witnesses, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and protective concern. Mrs. Hartley had insisted on attending to ensure that justice was properly served, while Pastor Williams had come to provide moral support during what promised to be an emotionally difficult proceeding. Morrison arranged multiple sealed envelopes across the conference table with ceremonial precision, each one marked with specific instructions that suggested Grandma Rose had anticipated every possible complication that might arise during this moment. Rose Morrison was extraordinarily thorough in her estate planning. Morrison began, his voice carrying the formal authority that legal proceedings required. She created what's known as a conditional inheritance document, which means that different sections of the will can only be accessed when specific criteria are met. Chen leaned forward with obvious confusion, his inexperience with complex estate law clearly showing. Is this type of conditional structure legally binding? It seems unnecessarily complicated for a straightforward inheritance distribution. Morrison's expression suggested he had been expecting this challenge. Conditional inheritance documents are completely legal when properly executed and witnessed. Judge Margaret Foster reviewed and validated this will structure 6 months before Rose's death, ensuring that every provision meets Kansas probate law requirements. He opened the first unsealed section, which contained standard bequests that surprised no one. $5,000 to the First Methodist Church, for building maintenance $3,000 to the local food bank, $1,000 each to longtime neighbors who had provided friendship and support over the decades. My parents exchanged glances that clearly indicated their impatience with these charitable distributions. Monica drummed her manicured fingernails against the table, while David checked his phone as if more important business demanded his attention. The second section, Morrison continued, addresses Elisa Morrison specifically. He paused to emphasize the legal significance of the name change that Grandma Rose had apparently arranged without my knowledge. Rose legally adopted Elisa 5 years ago, making her Rose Morrison's legitimate daughter and legal heir under Kansas inheritance law. The revelation hit like a physical blow. I had known that Grandma Rose loved me like a daughter, but I had never realized she had taken legal steps to formalize our relationship. The adoption papers were officially notarized and filed with the county courthouse, making me Rose Morrison's legal child with all the inheritance rights that status implied. Chen frantically scribbled notes as he realized that his client's claims to the estate had just become significantly more complicated. Blood relationship meant nothing compared to legal adoption, especially when the adoptive parent had clearly documented her intentions and motivations. Rose Morrison's letter explains her decision. Morrison continued reading from Grandma Rose's handwritten statement. I am adopting Elisa because she has been my true daughter in every way that matters for over 8 years. She has provided love, care, companionship, and support through my most difficult times. She has earned the right to be called my daughter and to inherit the legacy I have built through decades of hard work and careful planning. Monica's face had gone white with rage as she realized that their inheritance claims were evaporating before their eyes. This adoption is obviously fraudulent. An elderly woman was manipulated into changing legal documents by someone who wanted to steal her inheritance. Morrison produced psychiatric evaluations, medical assessments, and witness statements that documented Grandma Rose's complete mental competency throughout the adoption process. Judge Foster had personally interviewed her to ensure that the decision was made freely and with full understanding of its legal implications. The third section. Morrison continued ignoring Monica's outburst. Mentions a substantial inheritance for worthy family members, but the specific amounts and distributions are contained in sealed sections that can only be opened when particular conditions are met. He gestured toward the remaining envelopes, each one marked with detailed instructions that suggested complex challenges ahead. Rose Morrison designed this process to ensure that her inheritance would go to people who had genuinely earned it through demonstrated love and commitment. David finally exploded with the frustrated rage of a man watching his carefully planned fraud collapse. This is ridiculous. Blood family should have automatic inheritance rights, regardless of these manipulative games. We're being penalized for giving Mother independence and respecting her privacy. Independence. Mrs. Hartley repeated, her voice sharp with indignation. You abandoned your daughter and your mother for over 12 years. You had no contact with either of them until you heard there might be money involved. Chen attempted to restore order to the proceeding, but his efforts were undermined by his obvious inexperience with high-stakes inheritance disputes. Perhaps we could expedite this process by opening all sections simultaneously. My clients are facing significant legal expenses, and prolonged probate proceedings would create additional financial hardship. Morrison's smile was thin as winter ice. The will's structure is specifically designed to prevent expedited processing. Rose Morrison wanted to ensure that inheritance decisions were based on demonstrated merit, rather than legal manipulation or emotional pressure. He selected the first sealed envelope, its surface marked with precise handwriting that outlined the requirements for access. This section can only be opened when claimants demonstrate genuine care for Rose Morrison's physical and emotional well-being during her final years. The challenge was clear and deliberately structured to distinguish between people who had actually provided care and those who claimed to have done so from a distance. My parents would need to present evidence of their involvement in Grandma Rose's daily life medical care and emotional support. Monica attempted to present the same fabricated evidence they had used at the funeral, but Morrison systematically dismantled each piece of documentation with the thoroughness of a man who had been anticipating this moment for years. Hospital records show that Elisa was listed as Rose's emergency contact for over 3 years. Morrison stated spreading official medical documents across the table. She made all medical decisions, attended all appointments, and provided round-the-clock care during Rose's final illness. Dr. Newsom stepped forward as a witness, her professional authority lending weight to the testimony about my dedicated care during Grandma Rose's declining health. Elisa never missed a single medical appointment. She understood Rose's medications better than most nurses, managed her dietary restrictions, and provided emotional support that significantly improved Rose's quality of life. Chen desperately attempted to argue that emotional support from a distance should count as meaningful care, but Morrison produced calendar evidence that documented my constant presence versus my parents' complete absence. The first sealed section addresses physical property. Morrison announced opening the envelope with ceremonial precision. Elisa Morrison inherits full ownership of the farmhouse and all surrounding acreage, totaling 53 acres of prime Kansas agricultural land. My parents watched their inheritance disappearing piece by piece, their faces reflecting the horror of people who had planned an elaborate crime only to discover that their intended victim had anticipated every move. But Morrison was not finished. Multiple sealed envelopes remained on the table, each one representing additional challenges that would determine who truly deserved to inherit Grandma Rose's legacy. The reading was far from over, and the largest surprises were yet to come. Morrison opened his briefcase and produced a thick folder containing what appeared to be hundreds of photographs, medical records, and documented evidence spanning over a decade. His movements were deliberate as he spread the materials across the conference table, creating a visual timeline that would determine who deserved access to the first major inheritance provision. The first test requires demonstrating genuine care for Rose Morrison's physical and emotional well-being during her final years. Morrison announced his voice carrying the authority of a judge delivering a verdict. This section controls a significant portion of the estate, so the evidence must be comprehensive and verifiable. My parents exchanged confident glances, clearly believing their fabricated documentation would withstand scrutiny. Monica reached into her designer handbag and produced the same medical consultation, emails, birthday cards, and shipping receipts they had used at the funeral. "We have extensive evidence of our constant involvement in Mother's care," Monica declared, spreading her papers with theatrical precision. Email correspondence with medical specialists, documentation of care packages, sent regularly, coordination with local service providers to ensure Mother received proper assistance. David nodded gravely, adding his own collection of what appeared to be financial records. "We provided substantial monetary support through discreet channels respecting Mother's independence, while ensuring she had access to the best possible care. Family relationships don't always require constant physical presence when proper support systems are in place." Morrison examined their documentation with the careful attention of a forensic accountant, his expression growing increasingly stern as he identified each fabrication. These medical consultation emails contain several interesting discrepancies. The dates don't correspond with Rose's actual treatment schedule, the specialist names don't appear in any medical licensing databases, and the email headers show they were created last week rather than over the past several years. Dr. Newsom stepped forward with Grandma Rose's actual medical files, her professional demeanor lending authority to her testimony. "I was Rose Morrison's primary physician for over 20 years, and I can confirm that no outside family members were ever consulted about her treatment plans. Every medical decision went through Alessa, who was listed as Rose's official healthcare proxy and emergency contact." Chen attempted to object that medical privacy laws might have prevented Dr. Newsom from documenting other family involvement, but Morrison produced signed releases that gave Dr. Newsom permission to discuss Rose's care with any legitimate family members who expressed concern. "Rose specifically requested that I contact David and Monica if they ever inquired about her health," Dr. Newsom explained. "She wanted to give them opportunities to participate in her care if they showed genuine interest. They never once contacted my office during the entire 12 years of Elisa's residency with Rose." Morrison turned to the shipping receipts that Monica had presented as evidence of care packages. These receipts are equally problematic. The shipping dates post-date Rose's death by several weeks, and the return addresses correspond to a commercial mail service rather than residential locations, where David and Monica claim to be living. Mrs. Hartley pulled out her own documentation, a detailed calendar that she had been keeping for over 5 years. I live right next door and I see everyone who comes and goes from Rose's property. These people never visited, never sent packages, never even called during emergencies. Elisa was the only family member who provided any care whatsoever. The calendar was devastating in its thoroughness. Mrs. Hartley had documented every medical emergency, every doctor's appointment, every grocery delivery, and every social visit that had occurred at Grandma Rose's farmhouse. My name appeared on virtually every entry while my parents were completely absent from 5 years of detailed observations. Morrison produced hospital records from Grandma Rose's final hospitalization 6 months before her death. Rose Morrison was admitted for congestive heart failure and remained in intensive care for 11 days. The hospital attempted to contact all family members listed in her emergency information. Elisa was present within 20 minutes and remained at the hospital around the clock until Rose was stable enough for discharge. Dr. Newsom added her own testimony about that critical period. Elisa slept in Rose's hospital room every night, managed all communication with medical staff, made complex decisions about treatment options, and provided emotional support that was crucial to Rose's recovery. She understood Rose's wishes about end-of-life care better than most spouses understand their partner's preferences. Chen desperately attempted to argue that my parents might have been unreachable during the emergency due to travel or communication difficulties, but Morrison produced phone records showing that their numbers were actively in service and receiving calls throughout Rose's hospitalization. The hospital made 17 attempts to contact David and Monica over 11 days. Morrison stated presenting detailed call logs. Their phones were answered by voicemail services that indicated they were available for important messages. None of those messages were returned. Pastor Williams stepped forward with his own evidence of my dedicated care during Grandma Rose's final years. Elisa organized all of Rose's medication schedules, drove her to physical therapy appointments 3 times per week, modified the farmhouse to accommodate Rose's mobility limitations, and arranged for medical equipment rental when Rose needed assistance with daily activities. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. While my parents had been living their lives without a single thought for Grandma Rose's well-being, I had been managing every aspect of her physical and medical care with the devotion of a professional caregiver and the love of a genuine daughter. Morrison opened the first sealed envelope, his voice carrying satisfaction as he read the contents. Based on demonstrated care for Rose Morrison's physical and emotional well-being, this section of the inheritance goes entirely to Elisa Morrison. The bequest includes the farmhouse, all surrounding acreage farm equipment, livestock, and agricultural income from current crop leases. Monica's scream of rage echoed through the law office as she realized that the most valuable portion of the estate had just been awarded to me, based on merit rather than blood relationship. This is theft legal manipulation designed to steal inheritance from legitimate family members. David was frantically whispering instructions to Chen, but the public defender looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the evidence and the obvious validity of Morrison's documentation. There are additional sealed sections. Morrison announced calmly, each with its own requirements for access. The testing process is designed to ensure that Rose Morrison's legacy goes to people who genuinely earned it through demonstrated love and commitment. He selected the next envelope, its surface marked with even more specific requirements that suggested the challenges would become increasingly difficult. My parents had failed the first test completely, but Morrison's expression suggested that worse revelations were yet to come. Morrison's fingers traced the elaborate seal on the second envelope as he prepared to announce requirements that would probe even deeper into the reality of family relationships. The morning sunlight streaming through the law office windows created dramatic shadows across the conference table, illuminating the growing pile of evidence that documented 12 years of genuine care versus 12 years of calculated absence. The second challenge requires proof of contributing meaningfully to Rose Morrison's happiness and sense of purpose during her final decade. Morrison announced his voice carrying the weight of a man who had helped craft these requirements to distinguish between true family bonds and opportunistic claims. Monica leaned forward with desperate confidence, clearly believing this emotional criterion would be easier to fake than medical documentation. We brought Mother tremendous joy through our regular communications and surprise visits. She spoke constantly about how proud she was of our accomplishments and how much she looked forward to our phone calls. David nodded enthusiastically, apparently having rehearsed this testimony with his wife during their brief jail stay. Mother was always asking about our business ventures and expressing admiration for the life we had built together. We shared our travels with her through photographs and stories, giving her vicarious enjoyment of experiences she could no longer pursue herself. Their confident lies would have been convincing to anyone who had not known Grandma Rose personally, but Morrison was prepared to demolish their fabrications with the same systematic thoroughness he had applied to their medical claims. Let's examine the evidence of regular communications. Morrison said producing phone records that covered the past 5 years of Grandma Rose's life. These records show every incoming and outgoing call from Rose's landline and cell phone. David and Monica, can you identify which calls represent your regular communication with your mother? The pages of phone records were highlighted and annotated, showing thousands of calls over 5 years. My number appeared hundreds of times, along with calls to Dr. Newsom, Pastor Williams, Mrs. Hartley, and other local friends and service providers. But there were no calls whatsoever to David and Monica's numbers. Monica's face went pale as she realized the phone records completely contradicted their claims. Mother must have called our business numbers or used different phones. She was very private about family communications and might not have wanted to create records that could be misinterpreted. Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had anticipated every possible excuse. These records include all landline and cellular communications from Rose's residence. Additionally, Rose specifically requested that her phone service provider document all attempted calls to family members as part of her estate planning process. Dr. Newsom stepped forward with additional evidence from her regular appointments with Grandma Rose. Rose spoke frequently about Elisa during our medical consultations, but she never once mentioned receiving communications from David or Monica. She often expressed sadness about their absence and concern that they seemed to have forgotten about both her and Elisa. Pastor Williams produced a folder containing years of prayer requests that Grandma Rose had submitted to the church. Rose regularly asked for prayers for her son and daughter-in-law, but her requests were always focused on hoping they would reconnect with their family rather than celebrating ongoing relationships. She prayed for reconciliation, not continued closeness. Mrs. Hartley had brought her own collection of evidence documenting Grandma Rose's emotional state during the years of my parents' absence. Rose talked about David and Monica maybe twice a year, usually around birthdays or holidays when she was feeling particularly lonely. She always wondered what she had done wrong to drive them away, but she never mentioned receiving any communications from them. Morrison opened a photograph album that contained hundreds of images spanning the past decade. These pictures document Rose Morrison's daily life, her celebrations, her social activities, and her family experiences. Elisa appears in virtually every photograph, while David and Monica are completely absent from 10 years of documented memories. The photos were devastating in their completeness. Birthday celebrations where I was the only family member present to help Grandma Rose blow out candles. Christmas mornings where we opened gifts together in front of a tree we had decorated ourselves. Easter services where we sat together in the same pew we had shared for over a decade. Summer afternoons when we worked in the garden that provided vegetables for the entire neighborhood. But the most powerful evidence was a series of video recordings that Morrison had apparently been saving for this moment. Rose Morrison specifically requested that I document her thoughts about family relationships during our final meetings. These recordings were made to ensure that her true feelings about happiness and purpose would be preserved for inheritance proceedings. The first video showed Grandma Rose sitting in her favorite armchair, speaking directly to the camera with the clarity and confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted to say. Elisa has given me a reason to wake up every morning and a sense of purpose I never expected to find again. Grandma Rose said, her voice strong despite her failing health. She turned my house back into a home, my routine back into a family schedule, my later years back into some of the happiest times of my entire life. The video continued with Grandma Rose describing specific memories that demonstrated the depth of our relationship. Late-night conversations when I helped her process grief over Grandpa's death, shared laughter during old movies that we watched together every Friday evening, pride in my academic achievements and excitement about my future plans. David and Monica gave me heartbreak and abandonment. Grandma Rose continued in the recording. They took away my granddaughter and never looked back. They turned their backs on family when we needed them most, and they've shown no interest in rebuilding what they destroyed. Elisa gave me love, companionship, purpose, and joy. She's the daughter I always hoped to have. Monica was now sobbing with genuine emotion, though whether from shame, grief, or frustrated anger was impossible to determine. The video recordings were more damaging than any legal document because they captured Grandma Rose's true feelings about the family relationships that had shaped her final decade. Morrison played additional recordings where Grandma Rose discussed specific examples of how I had contributed to her happiness, teaching her to use modern technology so she could stay connected with old friends, organizing surprise visits from distant relatives she had not seen in years, creating photo albums that preserved family memories going back generations. Elisa helped me reconnect with my own history while building new traditions for the future, Grandma Rose explained in one recording. She understood that elderly people need both continuity and change, both respect for the past and excitement about tomorrow. She gave me both. The final video was particularly moving because it showed Grandma Rose during one of her last good days when her mind was clear and her words carried the authority of a woman who had lived long enough to understand what really mattered. Family is not about blood or biology or legal obligations, Grandma Rose said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that still held the fire that had sustained her through 91 years of life. Family is about showing up, caring deeply, making sacrifices, and choosing love every single day. Elisa chose to be my family, and I chose to be hers. That choice created the most meaningful relationship of my entire life. Morrison closed the video player and opened the second sealed envelope, his voice carrying deep satisfaction as he read the contents. Based on demonstrated contribution to Rose Morrison's happiness and sense of purpose, this section awards Elisa Morrison all personal belongings, family heirlooms, jewelry, artwork, antiques, and sentimental items contained within the estate. David and Monica watched helplessly as another major portion of their expected inheritance disappeared, awarded to me based on evidence of genuine family bonds that they had never bothered to create or maintain. Chen was frantically scribbling notes, but his inexperience was showing as he struggled to find legal challenges to Morrison's thorough documentation and Grandma Rose's clearly expressed wishes. Morrison gathered the remaining sealed envelopes, his expression suggesting that the most significant revelations were yet to come. My parents had failed 2 major tests, but the largest portion of the inheritance remained to be determined. Their criminal behavior was about to face its ultimate judgment. The atmosphere in Morrison's law office had grown thick with tension as my parents realized that their elaborate fraud was collapsing around them with methodical precision. David's hands had clenched into fists on the conference table, his knuckles white with barely restrained rage, while Monica's carefully applied makeup had begun to streak down her cheeks as her composure finally cracked under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Chen, the overwhelmed public defender, was shuffling through his notes with the desperation of a man who had just realized his clients had lied about every aspect of their case. His inexperience with high-stakes inheritance fraud was showing as he struggled to mount any coherent defense against Morrison's systematic dismantling of their claims. "This entire proceeding is a travesty of justice." David snarled, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a predator, backed into a corner. An elderly woman was clearly manipulated into restructuring her inheritance through emotional blackmail and psychological coercion. These recordings prove that Mother was not thinking clearly during her final years. Morrison's expression remained calm, but I could see the steel beneath his professional demeanor as he prepared to deliver what appeared to be his final devastating blow. Actually, David, the recordings prove exactly the opposite. Rose Morrison was thinking more clearly than she had in years, and she took specific steps to protect herself and Elisa from the criminal conspiracy you've been operating. Monica suddenly lunged toward Morrison's briefcase, her desperation overriding any pretense of civilized behavior. "I want to see what's in those remaining envelopes. We have a right to know what our mother left us. We're not going to sit here and watch some manipulative girl steal everything that should belong to her legitimate family." Sheriff Deputy Jake Thompson, who had been quietly observing the proceedings from the back of the room, stepped forward with the practiced alertness of a man accustomed to handling dangerous situations. His hand rested casually near his service weapon as he assessed the escalating threat level. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately." Thompson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made criminals reconsider their choices. "This is a legal proceeding, and any interference with court documents constitutes obstruction of justice." But Monica was beyond rational thought, her years of careful planning unraveling into hysterical rage as she realized that her inheritance fraud had been anticipated and countered at every turn. "You people have no idea what you're dealing with. We've invested everything in this inheritance. We have creditors. We have obligations. We have people who are expecting payment." David joined his wife's breakdown, his facade of respectability crumbling as he revealed the desperation that had driven their criminal conspiracy. "We borrowed money against this inheritance. We took out loans based on Mother's estate value. If we don't collect what we're owed, we face bankruptcy and criminal charges from our business partners." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. My parents had not simply planned to steal Grandma Rose's inheritance. They had already spent money they did not possess based on crimes they had not yet committed. Their financial desperation explained the urgency of their fraud and the viciousness of their threats against anyone who might interfere with their plans. Chen looked like he wanted to crawl under the conference table as his clients confessed to additional criminal activities during a legal proceeding that was being recorded for court records. His face had gone pale as he realized that David and Monica had just provided prosecutors with evidence of loan fraud and conspiracy charges that would extend their potential prison sentences by decades. "We're not leaving here without what belongs to us." David continued, his voice rising to a dangerous pitch as he stood and moved toward Morrison's remaining sealed envelopes. "Mother owed us this inheritance after years of neglect and abandonment. She chose a stranger over her own son, and we're not going to let that stand." Thompson moved between David and the conference table, his professional training evident in the way he positioned himself to protect both Morrison and the legal documents that represented the core of the inheritance dispute. "Sir, you need to step back and calm down." Thompson said, his hand now resting openly on his weapon as David's behavior escalated beyond verbal threats. Any attempt to interfere with legal proceedings or threaten court officers will result in immediate arrest for multiple felony charges. Monica was now screaming with the unrestrained fury of a woman who had lost all connection to social norms. "That girl brainwashed our mother against us. She poisoned Mother's mind with lies and manipulation until Mother forgot her own family. We're the victims here, not her." Mrs. Hartley could no longer contain her outrage at Monica's accusations. "Brainwashed, that child spent 12 years caring for your mother with the devotion of a saint. She gave up her teenage years to make sure Rose never felt lonely or abandoned. You're the ones who abandoned both of them without explanation or apology." Pastor Williams stood slowly, his tall frame adding moral authority to his words as he addressed the criminal behavior unfolding in front of him. "I've watched Elisa grow from a heartbroken 9-year-old into a remarkable young woman who honored your mother every day of her life. Your accusations against her are not just false, they're cruel beyond measure." But my parents were beyond shame or rational discourse. David was now attempting to physically push past Thompson to reach the sealed envelopes, while Monica hurled personal insults at me with the viciousness of someone who had finally revealed her true nature. "You manipulative little thief," Monica shrieked, pointing at me with shaking fingers. "You saw an opportunity to steal an old woman's fortune, and you played the role of loving granddaughter until you could claim everything for yourself. You're nothing but a con artist who targeted a vulnerable elderly woman." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because it contained any truth, but because it revealed the depth of Monica's inability to understand genuine love. She could not comprehend that my relationship with Grandma Rose had been built on authentic care and mutual affection because she had never experienced those emotions herself. Morrison finally stood his patience exhausted as he realized that David and Monica posed a physical threat to everyone in the room. "Deputy Thompson, I believe we need to suspend these proceedings until David and Monica Morrison can be properly restrained and medically evaluated for psychological instability." David made one final desperate lunge toward the sealed envelopes, his face twisted with rage as he attempted to grab what he believed was rightfully his. "We're not walking away empty-handed. Mother owed us this money, and we're going to take what belongs to us regardless of these legal games." Thompson moved with the swift efficiency of trained law enforcement, restraining David with professional technique, while Monica continued her hysterical rantings about family theft and legal manipulation. Within minutes, both of my parents were handcuffed and facing additional charges for threatening behavior, obstruction of justice, and attempted interference with legal proceedings. "The final irony," Morrison said as Thompson prepared to escort my parents from the law office, "is that Rose Morrison predicted this exact behavior in her final instructions to me. She knew that David and Monica would eventually reveal their true nature through their own actions, and she prepared accordingly." He selected the largest of the remaining sealed envelopes, its surface marked with warning labels that suggested its contents would deliver the ultimate judgment on my parents' criminal conspiracy. Rose Morrison was not a naive elderly woman who could be easily fooled. Morrison continued, his voice carrying deep respect for his deceased client. She was a strategic thinker who spent years documenting evidence and building an airtight case against the people who had betrayed her trust. As Thompson led my parents toward the door in handcuffs, Monica turned back with one final scream of rage that revealed the complete absence of maternal feeling that had characterized her relationship with me from the beginning. "You'll never be her real granddaughter, no matter what those papers say. Blood is blood, and you're nothing but a charity case who got lucky." The words would have devastated the abandoned 9-year-old girl I had once been, but the young woman I had become understood that Monica's cruelty was a reflection of her own emptiness rather than any truth about my worth or my relationship with Grandma Rose. Morrison waited until the law office door closed behind my parents before opening the envelope that would reveal the full scope of Grandma Rose's final strategy. His expression suggested that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. Now we can discuss the inheritance provisions that Rose Morrison created specifically for situations where family members revealed their criminal intentions. He said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man about to deliver ultimate justice. The game was finally over, but the victory was more complete than I had ever dared to imagine. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he broke the elaborate wax seal on the largest envelope, its surface marked with warnings that suggested the contents would fundamentally alter everything we believed about Grandma Rose's final intentions. The law office had fallen silent except for the sound of distant traffic and the soft hum of fluorescent lights that cast dramatic shadows across the conference table. This envelope was to be opened only in the event that David and Monica Morrison revealed criminal behavior during inheritance proceedings. Morrison announced, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets he had been carrying for years. Rose Morrison anticipated that they might resort to threats, manipulation, or violence when their fraud was exposed. He spread the contents across the table with reverent care, revealing documents that would change my understanding of my own identity and my place in Grandma Rose's life. The papers were meticulously organized, each one representing a piece of a larger strategy that Grandma Rose had been implementing for over a decade. The first document is a complete legal adoption decree. Morrison said, holding up an official certificate that bore the seal of the Kansas Family Court. Rose Morrison did not simply take you in as her ward, Elisa. She legally adopted you as her daughter when you were 11 years old, making you her legitimate heir under all applicable inheritance laws. The adoption papers were comprehensive and unambiguous. Grandma Rose had petitioned the court for full legal custody after my parents abandoned me, providing extensive documentation of their neglect and my need for permanent family stability. The court had granted her request based on overwhelming evidence that I would be better served by her care than by any attempt to reunite me with parents who had voluntarily relinquished their responsibilities. Mrs. Hartley gasped audibly as she realized the implications of the legal adoption. Rose never mentioned that she had made it official. She just said Elisa was her daughter now, and we all understood that she meant it in every way that mattered. Pastor Williams nodded with deep emotion, his eyes misting as he remembered the private conversations he had shared with Grandma Rose about her decision to formalize our relationship. Rose talked to me about the adoption process. She wanted to ensure that Elisa would never face uncertainty about her legal status or her place in the family. Morrison continued reading from Grandma Rose's detailed letter, which explained her motivations and her long-term planning in her own careful handwriting. I am adopting Elisa not just because I love her, but because she deserves legal protection from the people who abandoned her. David and Monica forfeited their parental rights through their actions, and I want to ensure that Elisa never again faces the possibility of being discarded by people who should protect her. But the adoption was only the beginning of Morrison's revelations. He produced additional documents that showed Grandma Rose had been working with federal investigators for over 2 years, building a comprehensive case against David and Monica's multi-state inheritance fraud operation. Rose Morrison contacted the FBI when she discovered that David and Monica had been involved in similar schemes targeting elderly relatives in other states. Morrison explained spreading investigation reports across the table. She agreed to help federal agents gather evidence that would prevent them from victimizing other families. The FBI files were extensive and damning. David and Monica had targeted elderly relatives across Montana, Texas, Ohio, and Illinois, using identical manipulation tactics to steal inheritances worth millions of dollars. They had abandoned a total of 8 children with various elderly family members, then returned to claim inheritances when those relatives died under suspicious circumstances. Your parents are part of an organized criminal conspiracy that has been operating for over 15 years. Morrison continued, his voice heavy with disgust at the scope of their crimes. They identify elderly relatives with significant assets, abandon children to create emotional bonds between the elderly person and the child, then return to claim inheritances through fraud and intimidation. Torres, the FBI investigator who had been quietly observing our proceedings, stepped forward with additional evidence that painted an even darker picture of my parents' criminal activities. We have documented at least 12 cases where David and Monica Morrison used abandoned children as unwitting accomplices in inheritance fraud. The children provided legitimate emotional connections to elderly relatives, while the parents remained absent until inheritance became possible. The revelation that I had been used as an unknowing tool in a criminal conspiracy made my stomach turn with nausea. My parents had not simply abandoned me out of selfishness or immaturity. They had deliberately placed me with Grandma Rose as part of a calculated strategy to manipulate her emotions and claim her inheritance when she died. But Morrison was not finished with his shocking disclosures. He produced a final set of documents that would reveal the true scope of what was at stake in this inheritance battle. Rose Morrison's estate is valued at $16.7 million. Morrison announced his words falling like bombshells in the quiet law office. The inheritance includes not just the farmhouse and land, but extensive stock portfolios, real estate investments, municipal bonds, and a private business that Rose built over 40 years of careful financial planning. $16.7 million. The number was so large that I could barely comprehend its meaning. Grandma Rose had lived modestly, driving an old pickup truck and shopping for groceries with coupons, never giving any indication that she possessed such extraordinary wealth. Rose accumulated this wealth through decades of careful investing and business ownership. Morrison explained producing financial records that documented her impressive business acumen. She owned Morrison Agricultural Services, which provided farming equipment and consulting to agricultural operations across 3 states. She also invested heavily in technology stocks during their early growth periods and purchased real estate in areas that later experienced significant development. Mrs. Hartley shook her head in amazement as she realized that her neighbor had been quietly building a fortune while maintaining the simple lifestyle of a Kansas farm woman. Rose never acted like she had money. She lived just like the rest of us, shopping for sales and growing her own vegetables. Rose Morrison was extremely private about her financial affairs because she understood that wealth attracts the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people. Morrison continued. She lived modestly by choice, not necessity, and she wanted to ensure that her inheritance would go to someone who loved her for herself rather than her money. Torres added her own perspective on Grandma Rose's financial privacy. Rose Morrison was actually instrumental in helping us track financial crimes across multiple states. She used her business connections and investment knowledge to identify patterns of inheritance fraud that other elderly victims had been unable to recognize or report. Morrison opened the final section of documents revealing Grandma Rose's ultimate gift and her final message to me. Rose Morrison has left her entire estate to Elisa Morrison, with the exception of charitable bequests that total approximately $500,000. But more importantly, she has left detailed instructions for how this inheritance should be used to protect other children who have been abandoned by criminal family members. The inheritance was overwhelming in its generosity, but the responsibility that came with it was equally profound. Grandma Rose had not simply left me money. She had entrusted me with the resources to continue the work she had begun in fighting family-based financial crimes and protecting vulnerable children. Rose Morrison's final letter contains her hopes for how this inheritance will be used. Morrison said, reading from Grandma Rose's handwriting one last time, "I am giving Elisa the tools she needs to build a life of purpose and meaning, but more importantly, I am giving her the resources to ensure that other children never experience the abandonment and manipulation that we both survived. Love multiplies when it is shared, and I trust Elisa to multiply the love she received by protecting others who need family as desperately as she once did." The magnitude of Grandma Rose's final gift was not measured in dollars, but in the opportunity she had created for me to transform my own painful experiences into healing for others. She had turned my abandonment into purpose, my suffering into strength, and my need for family into the foundation for creating family for those who had none. As I sat in Morrison's law office, surrounded by the community that had raised me and protected by laws that Grandma Rose had carefully arranged, I finally understood the full scope of the woman who had saved my life and then taught me how to save others. My parents' criminal conspiracy had failed completely, but their failure had revealed something far more valuable than money: the power of chosen family to create love that transcends biology and builds legacies that endure across generations. The inheritance was mine, but the real victory belonged to Grandma Rose, whose wisdom had anticipated every challenge and whose love had prepared me to meet them with strength and grace. 3 hours after my parents had been led away in handcuffs, Morrison's law office filled with federal agents who moved with the systematic efficiency of people who had been planning this operation for months. FBI agent Sarah Collins entered carrying briefcases and electronic equipment that suggested this inheritance reading had been the culmination of a much larger criminal investigation. This proceeding has been under federal surveillance since David and Monica Morrison first contacted local authorities about expediting probate proceedings. Agent Collins announced her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built her career dismantling criminal conspiracies. Everything that happened here today was documented as evidence in a multi-state inheritance fraud case that has taken 3 years to develop. Morrison's expression revealed that he had been coordinating with federal law enforcement throughout the entire probate process. Rose Morrison contacted the FBI 18 months before her death. When she discovered the scope of David and Monica's criminal activities, she agreed to help build a case that would prevent them from victimizing other families. Agent Collins spread case files across the conference table, revealing the true magnitude of the criminal operation that my parents had been running across multiple states. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications for dozens of elderly victims who had trusted their own family members. David and Monica Morrison are part of an organized inheritance fraud ring that has stolen over $43 million from elderly family members in 6 states over the past 15 years. Agent Collins explained, pointing to a map marked with crime locations. They use a consistent pattern: identify elderly relatives with substantial assets, abandon children to create emotional manipulation opportunities, then return to claim inheritances through forged documents and intimidation tactics. The FBI files contained photographs and documentation of other families who'd been destroyed by similar schemes, elderly grandparents who had been manipulated into changing their wills, children who had been abandoned and then used as unwitting accomplices in financial crimes, legitimate family members who had been intimidated or threatened into surrendering inheritance rights. Mrs. Hartley studied the photographs with horror, recognizing the pattern that had nearly destroyed our own family. How many children have they abandoned? How many elderly people have they stolen from? Agent Collins consulted her files before answering with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail of the case. 14 children abandoned across 6 states over 18 years. 11 successful inheritance frauds, totaling $43.7 million. 6 elderly victims who died under suspicious circumstances that are still under investigation for potential murder charges. Murder charges. The words hung in the air like poison gas, suggesting that my parents' criminal activities had escalated far beyond financial fraud into potentially lethal territory. They had not simply stolen money from elderly relatives, they may have hastened their deaths to accelerate inheritance timelines. Pastor Williams shook his head with the dismay of a man who had devoted his life to helping people find goodness in the world. I've seen evil in many forms during 40 years of ministry, but the deliberate destruction of family bonds for money represents a special kind of moral corruption. Agent Collins continued reading from her case files, revealing details that made my parents' crimes even more horrifying. The Morrison operation specifically targets elderly relatives who have taken in abandoned children because the emotional bonds make the elderly victims more vulnerable to manipulation. They exploit the natural human desire to care for family members, then use that compassion as a weapon for financial exploitation. Torres stepped forward with additional evidence that showed how sophisticated their criminal operation had become. We have documented coordination with corrupt attorneys, bribed court officials, forged medical records, and intimidation tactics that included threats of violence against witnesses who might testify against their claims. Jackson Pierce, the expensive attorney who had fled Kansas when the FBI investigation was revealed, was apparently just one member of a larger legal conspiracy that specialized in manipulating inheritance law to benefit criminal clients. Pierce and his associates operate across multiple states providing legal services to inheritance fraud operations. Agent Collins explained, they coach criminals on how to present fraudulent claims, help forge documentation that appears legally valid, and intimidate legitimate family members into accepting token settlements rather than fighting extended legal battles. Morrison produced a folder containing communications that Grandma Rose had secretly recorded with federal investigators over the past 18 months. Rose Morrison was instrumental in helping us understand how these fraud operations function from the victim's perspective. Her cooperation allowed us to identify patterns and connections that we had been unable to document through traditional investigation methods. The recordings revealed that Grandma Rose had been working as an undercover informant, using her interactions with David and Monica to gather evidence that would protect other families from similar victimization. She had risked her own safety to help federal agents build a case that would shut down the entire criminal operation. Rose Morrison was one of the bravest people I've ever worked with. Agent Collins said her professional demeanor softened by obvious admiration for Grandma Rose's courage. She continued gathering evidence even when her health was failing because she was determined to prevent David and Monica from destroying other families. The full scope of the federal sting operation was breathtaking in its complexity. FBI agents had been monitoring my parents' communications, documenting their coordination with criminal accomplices, tracking their financial activities, and building cases against dozens of co-conspirators who had participated in inheritance fraud schemes across multiple states. David and Monica Morrison face federal charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, child abandonment, money laundering, racketeering, and potentially murder in connection with suspicious deaths of elderly victims. Agent Collins announced consulting a legal document that listed charges extending across multiple pages. The potential prison sentences were staggering. If convicted on all charges, my parents could face life imprisonment without possibility of parole, especially if murder charges were successfully prosecuted in connection with elderly victims who had died under suspicious circumstances. The civil asset forfeiture proceedings will recover stolen money for previous victims' families. Agent Collins continued, property purchased with fraudulent inheritance money will be seized and liquidated to provide restitution for families who were victimized by this criminal operation. Mrs. Hartley asked the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. What about the other children who were abandoned? Are they safe now? Will they be reunited with their elderly relatives' estates? Agent Collins smiled for the first time since entering the law office, her expression brightening as she discussed the positive outcomes that had resulted from the investigation. We've been able to recover stolen inheritances for 7 families whose elderly relatives were victimized by this operation. The abandoned children are receiving counseling and legal assistance to help them understand that they were victims rather than accomplices in these crimes. The federal investigation had not simply punished criminals. It had provided healing and restitution for families who had been destroyed by inheritance fraud. Children who had blamed themselves for their abandonment were learning that they had been used as tools by people who understood neither love nor family loyalty. Morrison gathered the inheritance documents that officially transferred Grandma Rose's $16.7 million estate to my legal ownership. Rose Morrison's final wish was that this inheritance would be used to continue the work she began in protecting vulnerable families from financial predators, She trusted Alessa to use these resources responsibly and compassionately. Agent Collins produced additional documents that outlined federal programs designed to assist inheritance fraud victims and prevent future crimes targeting elderly family members. We'd like to partner with Elisa Morrison to create educational programs and support services that would help other families recognize and report inheritance fraud schemes before they result in financial or emotional devastation. The invitation to work with federal law enforcement in fighting family-based financial crimes felt like the natural continuation of Grandma Rose's mission. She had used her own victimization to help other families, and now I had the opportunity to use her inheritance to expand that work on a national scale. As I signed the documents that officially made me one of the wealthiest young women in Kansas, I understood that Grandma Rose's greatest gift was not money, but purpose. She had transformed my abandonment into strength, my suffering into compassion, and my need for family into the foundation for protecting others who face similar challenges. The federal agents began packing their evidence as the legal proceedings concluded, but their work was far from over. My parents' arrests had been the beginning, rather than the end of the investigation that would ultimately protect hundreds of families from inheritance fraud schemes. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Grandma Rose's legacy would continue through the work that her inheritance made possible. Love multiplied when shared, just as she had always promised, and her final gift would multiply across generations of families who would never know how close they had come to losing everything. 6 months after the federal trials that sent my parents to prison for 25 years each, I stood in the renovated basement of Grandma Rose's farmhouse, watching contractors install the final computer workstations for what would become the headquarters of the True Family Foundation. The space that had once stored canning supplies and Christmas decorations was being transformed into a center for protecting abandoned children and supporting elderly victims of family-based financial crimes. Morrison had remained my attorney throughout the complex process of establishing the foundation's legal structure, and his experience had been invaluable in creating programs that would effectively use Grandma Rose's inheritance to help families across multiple states. The Foundation's mission statement, written in my own words but inspired by her wisdom, hung prominently on the newly painted wall. Family is created through love, commitment, and daily acts of care. The True Family Foundation protects these bonds and helps create new ones when biology fails to provide them. Dr. Patricia Newsom had agreed to serve as the Foundation's medical director, bringing her decades of experience with elderly care to help identify and prevent medical manipulation that often accompanied inheritance fraud schemes. Her office occupied the corner of the basement that received the best natural light, and she had already begun developing screening protocols to help elderly people recognize signs of financial exploitation by family members. The Foundation's first client arrives this afternoon. Dr. Newsom announced consulting the appointment schedule that had quickly filled with referrals from social services agencies across Kansas. 10-year-old Emma Carlisle, abandoned by her parents at her great-aunt's farmhouse in Dodge City. The circumstances are remarkably similar to your own situation. Emma's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Parents who claimed they needed time to figure things out, promises of return that never materialized, and an elderly relative who had stepped in to provide the love and stability that biological family had failed to offer. But unlike my situation, Emma's great-aunt was struggling financially and emotionally with the responsibility of raising a traumatized child without support or resources. Mrs. Hartley had volunteered to coordinate the Foundation's volunteer programs, organizing community members who wanted to provide additional support for families dealing with abandonment situations. Her natural warmth and decades of experience helping neighbors had made her perfectly suited for matching volunteers with families who needed assistance. We have 47 volunteers signed up for the first training session next week. Mrs. Hartley reported her excitement evident as she discussed the community response to the Foundation's mission. People from 6 counties want to help, including several families who experience similar abandonment situations and want to prevent other children from suffering alone. Pastor Williams had agreed to provide counseling services for both children and elderly relatives who were struggling with the emotional aftermath of family betrayal. His office, in the farmhouse's former dining room, had been designed to feel warm and welcoming rather than clinical or institutional. The psychological damage from family abandonment runs deeper than most people realize. Pastor Williams explained arranging books and comfortable seating that would help children feel safe enough to discuss their experiences. Children blame themselves for their parents' choices, while elderly relatives often feel guilty for being unable to provide everything an abandoned child needs. Both groups need specialized support to heal from these experiences. The Foundation's financial structure had been designed to provide comprehensive support rather than just temporary assistance. Each family received not just monetary help, but also legal advocacy counseling services, educational support, and long-term planning assistance that would help them build stability and independence. Agent Sarah Collins had remained involved with the Foundation's development, helping create educational programs that would teach families how to recognize and report inheritance fraud schemes before they resulted in devastating losses. Her law enforcement perspective had been crucial in developing effective prevention strategies. We've identified patterns that allow families to spot potential inheritance fraud in its early stages. Agent Collins explained reviewing educational materials that would be distributed through senior centers and family service agencies. Early intervention prevents the emotional and financial devastation that occurs when fraud schemes are allowed to develop over years. The farmhouse itself had been carefully renovated to serve as both Foundation headquarters and a memorial to Grandma Rose's legacy. Her favorite reading chair remained in the living room, now surrounded by bookcases filled with resources for families dealing with abandonment and fraud. The kitchen where she had taught me to bake bread had been expanded to accommodate cooking classes for elderly relatives who were suddenly responsible for raising children. Rose would love seeing her home used this way, Mrs. Hartley said, running her hand along the kitchen counter where Grandma Rose had prepared thousands of meals with love and care. She always said this house was too big for one person, and now it's helping dozens of families build stronger bonds. The Foundation's first major success story was already developing in our work with Emma Carlisle and her great-aunt Dorothy. Financial assistance had allowed Dorothy to make home improvements that created a proper bedroom for Emma, while counseling services had helped both of them process the grief and anger that naturally followed family abandonment. Emma has started calling Dorothy Grandma Dot instead of Great-Aunt Dorothy, Dr. Newsom reported with satisfaction. The emotional bonding is progressing naturally as they both realize that chosen family can be just as strong as biological family. Morrison had been working with state legislators to strengthen inheritance laws that would better protect elderly people from family-based financial exploitation. The Foundation's legal advocacy program provided free representation for families who were fighting inheritance fraud or seeking to formalize adoption relationships like the one Grandma Rose had created with me. We've already prevented 3 inheritance fraud schemes in their early stages. Morrison reported consulting case files that documented the Foundation's growing impact. Early legal intervention saves families from years of manipulation and emotional trauma. The Foundation had also begun coordinating with similar organizations in other states, sharing information and resources that would help identify criminal operations that moved across state boundaries to avoid prosecution. The network effect was already proving valuable in tracking patterns and preventing new victims from being targeted. Thomas Wright from the First National Bank had helped establish financial literacy programs that taught elderly people how to protect their assets from manipulation, while still providing appropriate support for legitimate family members. The programs were designed to empower elderly people with knowledge, rather than making them suspicious of all family interactions. Financial education is one of the most effective tools for preventing inheritance fraud. Wright explained reviewing curriculum that covered everything from recognizing forged documents to establishing appropriate boundaries around financial discussions with family members. As I watched contractors install the final computer systems that would allow the foundation to serve families across multiple states, I felt Grandma Rose's presence in every detail of the work we were building together. Her inheritance had provided the resources, but her love had provided the inspiration for creating something that would protect other families from the destruction that she and I had survived. The Foundation's mission extended far beyond preventing inheritance fraud to include helping families understand that love and commitment create stronger bonds than biology ever could. Every success story would be a testament to Grandma Rose's wisdom and a continuation of the family legacy she had built through decades of choosing love over convenience. Emma Carlisle would never experience the isolation and uncertainty that I had felt as an abandoned 9-year-old because Grandma Rose's legacy would ensure that other children receive the support and protection that every child deserves. The True Family Foundation would multiply her love across generations of families who would benefit from her final gift. 2 years after the Foundation's establishment, I received a letter that would fundamentally change my understanding of my own story and expand the meaning of chosen family in ways I had never imagined possible. The envelope was addressed to a Lisa Morrison Director True Family Foundation, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, careful and hesitant, like someone who had spent considerable time deciding what words to use. The letter was from Marcus Chen, a 24-year-old medical student in Portland, Oregon, who'd been following the Foundation's work through news coverage of our successful programs helping abandoned children. His opening sentence took my breath away. "I believe David and Monica Morrison are my biological parents, and I think you might be my sister." Marcus had been abandoned at age 7, with his elderly great-aunt Helen in rural Oregon, told the same lies about parents who needed time to figure things out and promised to return when circumstances improved. Like me, he had never heard from them again, growing up believing that he had somehow driven away the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. His great-aunt Helen had provided the same kind of devoted care that Grandma Rose had given me, helping Marcus overcome the trauma of abandonment while encouraging his academic achievements and supporting his dream of becoming a pediatric surgeon. She had passed away during his freshman year of medical school, leaving him with cherished memories and the same kind of inheritance that suggested she had been far more financially successful than her modest lifestyle had indicated. I saw news coverage about the FBI investigation and recognized David and Monica's photographs immediately. Marcus wrote in careful script that suggested he had practiced this letter multiple times. I'd been researching their criminal activities and discovered that I'm one of at least 6 children they abandoned with elderly relatives over the past 20 years. I think it's time for us to find each other and begin healing together. The letter included Marcus's phone number and an invitation to contact him when I felt ready to explore the possibility that we might be biological siblings who had been separated by our parents' criminal conspiracy. He assured me that he had no interest in pursuing financial claims against the Foundation or Grandma Rose's estate, but simply wanted to connect with someone who understood the unique trauma of family abandonment. Dr. Newsom was with me when I called Marcus 3 days later, her presence providing emotional support as I navigated the complex feelings that accompanied this unexpected connection to my biological past. Marcus's voice was warm and thoughtful, carrying the same kind of gentle strength that I had learned to associate with people who had survived significant trauma and emerged with increased compassion. "I've been hoping to find other siblings for years," Marcus admitted during our first conversation. "Helen always encouraged me to believe that family extends far beyond the people who share our genetics, but she also thought I might find healing through connecting with others who experience similar abandonment." Our stories were remarkably parallel despite the geographical distance between Kansas and Oregon. Both of us had been raised by elderly relatives who had provided unconditional love and practical wisdom. Both of us had excelled academically as a way of honoring the sacrifices our chosen family had made. Both of us had struggled with questions about our worth and identity in the aftermath of parental abandonment. Helen used to tell me that some people are born into families while others have to build them from scratch. Marcus said, his voice carrying the same kind of affection for his great-aunt that I felt for Grandma Rose. She said building family from scratch often creates stronger bonds because they're based on choice rather than obligation. 3 weeks later, Marcus flew to Kansas to visit the foundation and meet the community that had raised me after my abandonment. His resemblance to me was unmistakable, despite our different upbringings suggesting that genetics had provided certain physical characteristics, even though love and environment had shaped our personalities and values. Mrs. Hartley immediately adopted Marcus as an honorary grandson, insisting that he stay at her house during his visit and treating him with the same protective warmth she had shown me throughout my childhood. Pastor Williams spent hours discussing theology and philosophy with Marcus, clearly impressed by his thoughtful approach to questions about suffering, purpose, and redemption. "Your foundation is exactly what Helen would have wanted to see," Marcus told me as we walked through the farmhouse that had become my headquarters and memorial to Grandma Rose's legacy. She always said that surviving trauma creates an obligation to help others avoid similar pain. Dr. Newsom was fascinated by the parallel development between Marcus and me, noting that our similar responses to abandonment suggested that resilience and compassion could emerge from traumatic experiences when appropriate support systems were available. "Both of you transformed your pain into purpose," she observed, watching Marcus interact with Emma Carlisle and other children who were receiving foundation services. "The qualities that made you successful as abandoned children are the same qualities that make you effective at helping other families heal from similar experiences." Marcus's medical training provided valuable perspective on the foundation's work, particularly in developing programs that address the physical health consequences of emotional trauma. His research on childhood abandonment had taught him that psychological wounds often manifested as physical symptoms that required integrated treatment approaches. Abandoned children frequently develop stress-related health problems that persist into adulthood. Marcus explained, reviewing case files with Dr. Newsom. "Comprehensive care needs to address both emotional and physical healing if we want to achieve lasting recovery." During Marcus's week-long visit, we discovered that our parents had abandoned 4 additional children with elderly relatives across Montana, Texas, and Colorado. Each abandonment had followed the same pattern: parents claiming temporary circumstances that required placement with elderly family members, promises of return that never materialized, and eventual inheritance fraud attempts when the elderly relatives died. "We need to find the others," Marcus said with the determination of someone who had spent years feeling isolated by unique trauma. "They shouldn't have to heal alone when we've learned so much about recovery and building chosen family relationships." Morrison helped us develop legal strategies for locating and connecting with our other biological siblings, while protecting their privacy and respecting their individual healing processes. Some might not want contact with family members connected to their trauma, while others might be eager for the kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience. The Foundation's victim advocacy programs provided a framework for approaching other abandoned siblings, with offers of support rather than demands for relationship. Each person would be allowed to determine their own level of involvement, whether that meant occasional communication, active participation in foundation programs, or simply knowing that understanding family members were available if needed. This is how chosen family works. I told Marcus as we reviewed plans for expanding the Foundation's sibling reconnection services. "We offer love and support without conditions or expectations, allowing each person to build relationships at their own pace and comfort level." Agent Collins helped us understand the legal implications of sibling reconnection in the context of ongoing federal prosecutions. Our parents' criminal trials had resulted in convictions that would keep them imprisoned for decades, but their cases had also generated information that could help us locate and support other victims of their abandonment schemes. The federal investigation identified 17 elderly relatives who were targeted by David and Monica Morrison over 23 years. Agent Collins reported consulting files that documented the full scope of our parents' criminal activities. Each case represents potential siblings and chosen family members who might benefit from Foundation support services. As Marcus prepared to return to Oregon and complete his medical training, we made plans for him to visit Kansas regularly and eventually join the Foundation's board of directors when his residency was complete. His medical expertise would be invaluable in developing programs that address the long-term health consequences of family trauma. Helen always told me that family is something you build rather than something you inherit, Marcus said, as we stood in Grandma Rose's garden watching vegetables grow in soil that had been tended with love for decades. You and Grandma Rose built something here that's going to help families for generations. The Foundation's work had come full circle, evolving from my personal healing into a resource that could help other abandoned siblings reconnect and support each other through shared understanding. Grandma Rose's inheritance continued to multiply, creating chosen family connections that extended far beyond the biological relationships that had failed us. As I watched Marcus's plane disappear into the Kansas sky, I felt Grandma Rose's presence in the certainty that love truly does multiply when shared. Our family was growing through choice and commitment, creating bonds that were stronger than genetics because they were built on mutual respect and genuine care. The boy who had once felt as alone as I had was no longer isolated, and neither of us would ever again face life's challenges without the support of people who chose to love us unconditionally. 5 years have passed since that devastating day when my parents crashed Grandma Rose's funeral with their calculated greed and false grief, and as I sit in the garden, she loved so dearly watching my daughter Rose take her first tentative steps across the same lawn where I learned to heal from abandonment. I understand that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. The farmhouse behind me bustles with the activity of the True Family Foundation's expanded programs, which now serve over 300 abandoned children and elderly victims annually across 15 states. Marcus completed his medical residency and moved to Kansas last year, establishing a pediatric practice that works closely with our foundation while serving on our board of directors. Together, we've connected with 3 of our other biological siblings, each of whom has chosen their own level of involvement in our chosen family network. My parents are serving their sentences in separate federal facilities, their criminal empire completely dismantled, and their stolen millions returned to victim families through civil asset forfeiture proceedings. They will be eligible for parole when they are both well into their 70s, though their multiple convictions make early release unlikely. I feel no anger toward them anymore, only sadness for the love they chose to reject, and the family bonds they destroyed through their pursuit of money that could never have brought them genuine happiness. Brian, my husband of 3 years, emerges from the Foundation's offices, carrying our daughter and wearing the patient smile of a man who understands that his wife's work requires irregular hours and emotional investment. He grew up in foster care after his own family abandonment, which means he truly understands the mission that drives our foundation and the healing that comes from transforming pain into purpose. Emma called from college. Brian says, settling beside me on the porch swing, that Grandma Rose loved. She wanted to thank you again for the scholarship and to report that she's decided to major in social work with a focus on family preservation programs. Emma Carlisle, now 19 and thriving in her junior year at Kansas State University, was our foundation's first success story. Her relationship with Dorothy has become one of the strongest family bonds I've ever witnessed, proving that age differences matter far less than commitment and mutual care when building chosen family relationships. Dorothy says Emma still calls her every day. I reply, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from witnessing love multiply across generations. They're planning to spend Christmas here at the farmhouse with all the other foundation families who want to celebrate together. The holiday celebrations have become annual traditions that bring together chosen families from across the region, creating connections that extend far beyond individual relationships to build community networks of support and understanding. Children who once felt isolated by their abandonment experiences now have dozens of surrogate aunts, uncles, grandparents, and siblings who understand their journey and celebrate their healing. Mrs. Hartley, now 86 and still volunteering with the foundation 3 days per week, joins us on the porch with the slow dignity of a woman who has earned her rest but refuses to take it. Her dedication to helping abandoned children has never wavered, though she now focuses more on emotional support and less on the physical demands of case management. Judge Foster called to discuss the new legislation that strengthens protection for elderly inheritance rights. Mrs. Hartley reports settling into her favorite rocking chair with the satisfaction of someone who has witnessed justice prevailing over criminal intent. The Morrison Act passed both houses of the state legislature and will be signed into law next month. The Morrison Act, named in honor of Grandma Rose's courage in exposing inheritance fraud schemes, creates stronger legal protections for elderly people, while establishing clearer guidelines for recognizing and prosecuting family-based financial crimes. The legislation has been used as a model by other states seeking to protect vulnerable elderly residents from exploitation by relatives who prioritize money over family bonds. Pastor Williams arrives for our weekly dinner gathering carrying fresh vegetables from his own garden and wearing the contented expression of a man who has spent his life helping others find meaning in their suffering. His counseling work with foundation families has expanded into a statewide program that trains other ministers and social workers in addressing abandonment trauma. I had coffee with Marcus this morning. Pastor Williams says arranging his vegetables on the porch table where we share informal meals during pleasant weather. His research on childhood abandonment is being published in the Journal of Pediatric Medicine, and he's been invited to present his findings at the National Conference on Family Trauma. Marcus's medical research has provided scientific validation for what Grandma Rose understood intuitively. Children who receive consistent love and support after abandonment can not only recover from their trauma, but often develop increased empathy and resilience that serves them throughout their lives. His work has influenced treatment protocols in pediatric medicine and family therapy programs across the country. As the sun sets over the Kansas prairie that stretches endlessly beyond Grandma Rose's beloved farmhouse, I reflect on the profound life lesson that her legacy has taught me through 5 years of foundation work and chosen family building. True family is not determined by genetics or legal documents or social expectations, but by the daily choice to love someone unconditionally, regardless of circumstances or personal cost. Grandma Rose chose to love an abandoned 9-year-old girl who arrived on her doorstep carrying nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. That choice created a family bond stronger than any biological connection could have been, because it was renewed every day through acts of care, sacrifice, and commitment that proved love was more than just feeling, but action taken consistently over time. My parents chose money over family convenience, over commitment and personal gain, over the profound joy that comes from loving someone more than yourself. Their choice led them to federal prison and the permanent loss of relationships that could have brought meaning to their lives, while Grandma Rose's choice led to a legacy that continues to multiply love across hundreds of families and will endure for generations. The True Family Foundation exists because one elderly Kansas farm woman decided that an abandoned child deserved unconditional love, and that criminal behavior should not be allowed to destroy family bonds that were built through genuine care and daily devotion. Her courage in fighting inheritance fraud protected not just her own estate, but countless other families who will never know how close they came to losing everything to people who confused money with love. Every child we help, every elderly person we protect, every chosen family we support creates new ripples of love that extend far beyond our direct influence. Emma's social work career will help hundreds of families. Marcus's medical research will influence treatment for thousands of children. The siblings we've reconnected will build their own legacies of love and service that honor the elderly relatives who saved them from abandonment. This is how love works when it's genuine rather than conditional, sacrificial rather than selfish, and committed to building something lasting rather than taking whatever seems immediately available. Love multiplies when shared, just as Grandma Rose always promised, and her final gift continues to create new families and heal old wounds through the simple power of choosing compassion over convenience. As Brian carries our daughter inside for her bedtime routine, and our chosen family members prepare for another evening of shared stories and mutual support, I understand that Grandma Rose's greatest gift was not the $16.7 million that funds our foundation's work, but the profound understanding that family is something we build through love rather than something we inherit through biology. My parents thought they were crashing a funeral to claim an inheritance, but they actually walked into a celebration of chosen family bonds that no amount of money could ever buy and no legal manipulation could ever destroy. Have you ever experienced a moment when you realized that the family you chose meant more to you than the family you were born into? I'd love to hear about your own chosen family stories in the comments below, because I believe these connections are some of the most powerful and healing relationships we can build in our lives. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking this video to help other people find hope in their own difficult family situations. Subscribing to our channel helps us continue sharing stories about resilience, healing, and the incredible power of chosen family bonds that can transform pain into purpose. I hope you'll share this story with someone who might need to hear that abandonment is not the end of their story, but potentially the beginning of finding the family they truly deserve. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may you find the same kind of unconditional love that Grandma Rose showed me when I needed it most.